A lot of what happens in trauma healing and trauma recovery isn't just in two people sitting in a room talking about the past.
Before we get into the show, I'd like to say a huge thank you to our sponsor, First Human, of which I am a co-founder. First Human is dedicated to extraordinary impact in the world through exceptional leadership. So if you're looking to elevate the leadership of your team or your organization, then do check us out. We also offer one-to-one coaching. So if you'd like to get coached by me or one of my extraordinarily talented fellow coaches, then head over to firsthuman.com. And with that, back to the show. And welcome. We're live with another episode of Being Human. I'm delighted to say I'm here with Wendy D'Andrea. She is the Chief Science Officer at the Trauma Research Foundation. She's Professor of Psychology at the New School in New York, where she specializes in trauma and psychobiology. She is an author and co-author of a panoply of papers in the space of trauma and trauma treatment. I mean, just mind-blowingly broad. Your research, the body of work is extremely impressive. And I've read only a subset of them in preparation for this interview, and extremely fascinating to enter some of your world of research. And really delighted to have you on the show, Wendy.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So, like with all my guests, I love to ground us in your background, where you grew up, a little bit about your early family life, to get a sense of you before we dive into your body of work.
Yes. So I'm from the United States, and I grew up in the Midwest in Ohio. So for a broad audience, that would be a place that emphasizes being very polite, and a place that eats a lot of casserole, where you basically mix together a lot of foods and a can of Campbell's soup, and then you put it in the oven, and a place where people drive very slowly. And that was sort of there's a lot of, I experienced it as having a strong push towards middle class conformity. And I now live in New York, which feels a little more my speed in terms of having a lot of variety in terms of people and food and ways of being in the world. So that's been fantastic. And in terms of my sort of more immediate context of my family, there are so many of us who came to this field of trauma work for reasons that really echoed our own experiences. And I am no exception to that. So as a colleague of mine says, research is me search. And Alice Miller in Drama of the Gifted Child also talks a lot about how people who experienced a lot of chaos and were in strong caretaking positions relative to their parents are often drawn to this work. So that's true for my family as well. I wound up my parents had multiple substance abuse issues, and I wound up living with my grandparents from about 3.5 on. But things were pretty complicated with them as well. And so my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who I lived with, died when I was 9 of cancer. And I then wound up doing a lot of caretaking for my grandfather, who was much older. And quite ill. And so I took care of him and managed all of his health crises and all of that from about 9 until he died when I was 17. I also had passed away in the interim. And my dad's family and I were not in contact for a long, long time until very recently. So I was someone who really, really benefited from my community really investing in me, and a lot of people coming around and supporting. And, there are a lot of gaps they couldn't fill, but a lot of ways in which really loving and generous people made sure that I got through and helped me find a path that let me see a different life. And So I started focusing really on trauma as my area of study, really by the middle of my freshman year in college, and started working as a rape crisis advocate, where I would meet people who had just experienced a sexual assault and go through the process of evidence collection, which is really a medical examination, removing evidence from their bodies, and then go through the legal system with them. And that's sort of what got me off and running in this field.
Oh wow, what a start! And that's for a young woman. Wow, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And just as you said, you had other figures, and I'm just thinking of Alice Miller's work. So would you relate to those as enlightened witnesses? I think that's the term she uses, right?
Oh,
People
I
who
think that's
could
such a
go on.
great phrase. Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense. And there's a phrase in the field that we use, one safe person, that a lot of kids can really build something for themselves despite the chaos around them, if they really have one safe person to go to. And I had more than one, but I love that way of thinking about, you don't have to save every kid. You don't have to house every orphan, but maybe if there's one kid who sort of spark you see and who you can speak to, then that may really make a difference for someone's whole life. So depth versus breadth in that way.
And you had, it sounds like you had at least one of those.
I did. I had more than one of those, fortunately. Yeah.
Great. And so did that allow you to get a sense early on that these were unusual circumstances, that these were, that you were, mainly not the term traumatized, but that you were experiencing extreme difficulty? I mean, that's what it sounds like to me. Did you have a sense of that context from an early age?
Yes and no. When I started with talking about my experience in the Midwest, we lived in the suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio. And I was one of the few kids who lived in an apartment, not a house. We had also, in addition to all the chaos, were very, very low income. So that was different. Living with my grandparents was different. I had a lot of conversations with other kids where they assumed my parents were dead when my mom did die when I was 14, but they weren't, and sort of trying to explain that no, there were just all of these other problems, made a sense of difference. And at the same time, there were things about it that just felt like life. It's hard for a fish to see the water it swims in.
Yeah.
And there were other pieces of it too that also, as much as they were a burden, they did also feed a sense of accomplishment for me. So I did all the cooking and all of the cleaning, and I gave my grandpa his insulin and tested his blood sugar every day. And so that there was sort of pretty immediate feedback in the community that I was doing something big for my age. And that was something that became a real cornerstone of my identity. I sometimes, you spoke to the breadth of my work, and I sometimes, I've had to learn to have a little less self-efficacy, to not have to do it all and not have to kind of, just push through, and to let myself rest and to rely on help. And that's been important.
Right. That's interesting. And I think we spoke of this before we had the show, but Gabor Mate saying something similar about, from his traumatic experience, developed this incredible capacity, productive capacity, and sometimes regretting that he had been compelled to work so hard. Yeah.
I've been pretty good about managing work-life balance. So that's I get to learn from those lessons from other people.
Yeah. And so you, in freshman, you started working with these rape survivors, and were you simultaneously engaging in your own healing work, or did that come later? Yeah.
That came later. Through a lot of my sort of early adulthood in college, a lot of my narrative was really built in this sort of post-traumatic growth frame of like, oh, look, I am so compassionate and I am so strong and I'm doing great. And it was like the great mystery of my life of like, why was I doing okay when other people seemed to struggle so much? And it took a long time to come around and realize like, oh, I am really anxious and I am really worried about making a mistake. And I am like the sort of internal manager parts and internal judgment and all of that stuff is really loud in a way that maybe wasn't true for everyone. So it took a while. When I started grad school, that work really started there.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes some sense. And so your early work with these rape survivors, this is where you were starting to develop your appreciation of trauma and its impacts, and you were studying at the same time as working with these individuals.
Yes, and so there were a few things that were really critical to me. One of the pieces that was really critical for me at that point was like just my own understanding that I had a pretty high capacity for distress, including other people's distress. And so there was a way of like this work is work that I can do and kind of and ride through all of that intensity that can be so overwhelming for people. It's also it's almost hard for me to wrap my head around that being overwhelming for people to bear witness. One of the other pieces about the survivors themselves was really seeing the sort of scrambling of memory and physical experiences where people would have these very embodied responses of not, having a flashback or a body memory and not having any sort of sense of what had led to that. And that was a pretty compelling thing to watch happen. And then the other piece was this sort of traumatic-genic dissociation, and where people really, in the course of their trauma and its aftermath, really lost core components of what had happened in the experience. And that as a fact of like that the mind could do that the mind could sort of cancel something out and blank it out as a way of kind of saving people or preserving something for them was really powerful to see. And so, but what was really compelling about that to me was, on the one hand, here was this self-preservation technique that people had of letting themselves not know when it was too much to know. And on the other hand, that was so weaponized by systems. So if someone couldn't remember some core component of their experience, they were so easily and readily dismissed. And by their families, and certainly by the police, and seeing the great sort of societal pull to minimize and dismiss trauma that hinged upon the very thing that let people survive, was a really compelling paradox that made me want to move into this space for reasons that were both scientific and related to activism and human rights. And so to me, those felt like they really went hand in hand.
Interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating. And so your study at that point, so you describe your specialism as trauma and psychobiology. And in the early phase of your career, like what exactly were you developing in terms of your understanding of trauma, and where was your research directed at to begin with?
Well, when I was a baby undergrad, I did this study where I tried to evoke state-dependent memory and use contextual cues to evoke state-dependent memory. And I thought I had there's a rule in research: don't let an hour in the library cost you a year in the lab. And there were no, I went to a small undergrad college, Oberlin College. It's a small psych department. There weren't trauma experts in there. There were memory experts and general psychopathology experts. And I thought I had sort of discovered that you could evoke a memory through sensory cues. And it turns out I was not the person to discover that. I was a little late to that game. And as I was finishing my thesis, discovered the work of some guy with this weird name, Bessel van der Kolk, and was like, oh, okay, well, I guess he's onto something too. And from that point, sort of decided that eventually at some point I would make my way to working with him. When I went into grad school, my grad school mentor and I were really focusing a lot on the question of what is happening biologically when people are dissociating, and what are the consequences of that. And I wanted then to move into doing something in the treatment realm. And I had a couple of primary interests in moving into the treatment work as a grad student, as a doctoral student. And one was I simply wanted to get mentored research experience from someone who had done treatment research. My doctoral advisor, Namdi Pol, had done treatment research, because those are skills that you can't just pick up out of the blue. And so I really wanted that mentored research experience. The other piece that was compelling to me was that there's entire narrative in the trauma research treatment field, which is very separate from what often happens in treatment as it actually plays out, which was very focused on really intense kinds of interventions that involve deep retelling and reliving of the trauma to the extent possible in a very condensed time frame, with the idea that what people will do is learn to tolerate their distress. And so one of my goals was to try to understand whether the theory of what the treatment is doing matches what seems to be happening from a sort of mechanistic perspective, from the perspective of how memory is changing, from how attention is changing, from how biology is changing. So I wanted to bring all of this psychobiology work into the treatment field. And one of the things we discovered at that point was that people who were doing this intense reliving had a shift in their biology that would be actually much more consistent with, and this is not, the study was not the most sort of solid design. This is for this particular hypothesis. There's other stuff in which we're still sort of trying to untangle this, but their biology didn't suggest that they were necessarily regulating. Their biology suggested that they might be dissociating. And so instead of showing this reduction in distress that is due to sort of processing and accommodating the trauma, it looked actually like, for people who had had a lot of intense trauma exposure in their background, this method of really intense trauma therapy that didn't build in skills or self-regulation was really actually kind of the reduction in distress was because they were inducing dissociation. So that was one of the things that really kind of pushed me into wanting to understand more about, when we say something works, how do we understand what works means? And if someone just says, I feel less distressed, is that the whole story, or is there more to the story? Is there something we can offer people by way of a fuller life that is not just built on less distress?
That's fascinating. That's very interesting, because from my own healing work, I have done a lot of reliving, and it has been very intense. And I don't relate to becoming more dissociated as a result. And so it's interesting. I mean, I know you're working with cohorts, and this is a case of statistical significance. But yeah, I find
and one of the other pieces is in the field. We have the field went through a long history where it became very prescriptive around treatment, and was sort of saying, if you don't do this treatment in this way, well, you're just avoiding things, and we won't support you avoiding things. Okay. And so to me, it's not so much about the question of does anyone benefit for it? It's the question of pushing forward that it is the only option and taking choice off the table. And so I think, it's a question of giving people a menu, even if it's not an endless menu, that lets them kind of be partners in choosing the shape of their adventure. And part of the reason that's important to me, just philosophically, is that so much about trauma is about loss of choice. And so telling people, look, this is what we think might be really powerful, but if that's not where you're ready to start, we can start somewhere else. I think that's just a humane way of proceeding.
And I absolutely love your phrase there. Yeah, partners in co-creating the shape of your adventure. I mean, what a beautiful way to put it. But that kind of language. Rather than a patient of a therapist, right? That's a very different way of framing. What we're talking about here, right? Yeah, no, that's fascinating. So your early work. So you were finding that people going through these particular therapeutic processes could actually result in them, from a biological perspective, becoming more dissociated. And then in what way did that? What did that then lead to? What did that
then lead to? Well, there were a few things that were happening with that at once. I think one of the pieces that that was leading me to was wanting to understand how the way that this is sort of putting a lot of things together in a not necessarily linear way, but in terms of the timeline of what was happening, I did go on to work with Bessel van der Kolk for my postdoc. And one of the clinic that he had founded and for which he was medical director was part of a larger social service agency. And there was this beautiful sub-program that this place ran residential treatment facilities for kids who had been removed from their families and were in these sort of meant to be therapeutic residential schools because they couldn't be maintained safely in the community. And all of these kids, 100% of these kids had substantiated maltreatment histories. So like Child Protective Services had determined that they had experienced abuse. Many of them had their parental rights terminated and then were placed with adoptive families who then couldn't hold them. And so they were in these schools to try to build enough regulatory skills to return to the community. But being in a residential facility has all these really strict prohibitions: no touch, no running, no kid stuff, right? And kids would tell stories like kids would run away, and this is a major issue at the facility. Or kids would act out in some violent way. And kids would say, I run away to get caught. I don't run away to get away. I run away to get caught, because that is literally the only time anyone puts their arms around me. And so the program, Susan Wayne, who had been the former president of this organization, in her retirement founded this sub-program that ran across the school, all of these schools, this conglomerate of schools, to have the kids play sports. And her initial goal was just, I want kids to have 1 or 2 hours a week where they can just act like kids and run around and bump into each other and do all of this normal kid stuff and just do something sort of fun and goal-directed that wasn't just being therapy. So beautiful idea, but the kids weren't ready for it. So it would turn into like a cage match. Like one kid would step on another kid's foot, and because they were so threat reactive, it would turn into a brawl. And so they were on the verge of shutting this program down. And then they brought in this beautiful, this consultant who does beautiful work, a man named Lou Bergholz. And Lou is basically a grown-up camp counselor. And that is like he's going to run camps forever. That's just who he is. He's always wearing a silly hat. He's always playing a game. He's just magic. And he reformulated the program to help the coaches understanding that some of the coaching techniques were actually really activating the threat reactivity of the kids. So if you think about like, I don't know, soccer or football game, there are all these coaches and parents standing on the sidelines screaming about the thing you're supposed to do to get it right. Really not the right setup for an intensely trauma exposed kid. And so he flipped the entire thing, and he said, don't coach the kids on the court or on the field. There was basketball and there was also soccer, football, and coach the kids standing next to you. help the kid standing next to you observe what's going on and develop their own capacity to then observe themselves when they're on the field.
Right.
And take all the yelling out and take all the screaming out and take all the pressure out. And it was completely magic. These kids like went from this like complete brawl mindset at the beginning to doing cheers to help their opponents, to helping their opponents off the field if one of them was injured, to doing this whole mindset of like, you were here and you showed up and that's what matters. And yeah, you missed the basket, but you were so much closer than last week.
Right.
And some kids, and for some kids were, going to go on to play basketball or something more competitively, but some kids just got the relief of being able to feel like they could do something with their friends, with their bodies. And so what was happening with that was really understanding that a lot of what happens in trauma healing and trauma recovery isn't just in two people sitting in a room talking about the past. So much, I call this, I've come to call this the therapy of the everyday.
Right.
And thinking about what we can do in just the environments that are around us, schools, hospitals, friend relationships, dance classes, yoga classes, whatever, to make those be experiences that are enriching for people who are trauma exposed, and actually probably do a lot for people who aren't trauma exposed too.
Sorry, go on, finish your point.
Yeah, no, please.
No, I was going to say that was because I read your paper on that, and where you talked about the various ways in which this type of sports play was different, for highly trauma exposed people. And yeah, one of my thoughts was, why aren't we doing that for all kids, or at least certain elements?
Absolutely.
Like the warm up, for example, where you're encouraging people to feel into their body sensations and breath work before and after the game. And I was like, wow, that surely that would just be, awesome in general as a set of practices to get kids involved in as part of learning sports.
So here's one of the structural problems with this. And this is not my work. I observed this work and was present for it happening, but it's not my work. This was the work of a program called Trauma Drama that was Joe Spinazzola sat at the helm of. And one of the things that happens is, you get more self-regulation out of kids. You get their ability to stay calm, but you also get their voice and their willingness to say when something isn't right. And not all systems want to hear from kids and sort of saying, this is unfair that we're being treated this way. This program, Trauma Drama, was doing similar things to the sports program, but with theater. And kids and parents loved the program, but teachers did not. Because kids would start saying things like, hey, if we're acting rowdy, taking recess away from us is the wrong thing to do. And so they would start calling their teachers out on things that felt unfair. Or if that kid hit me, why do I get a timeout? That's not fair to me. I didn't do anything wrong. And would start speaking up against what they perceived as injustice. And schools were not prepared to accept or tolerate that work. And so why we don't do it is because we haven't sort of sorted out that we really want to, that means really respecting the autonomy of far more people than whose autonomy we currently respect. And we haven't really shaped institutions to be able to hold that yet, I think. We haven't given the resources to make that feasible.
Right. Oh, well, that's another great way of putting it. You're not making them wrong. You're saying we haven't yet given them the resources. Yeah, that makes sense. But in certain contexts, you described this guy with the silly hat and was able to work with the coaches. You can create a culture, right, where you can have this style of play available to the kids. Yeah. And encouraging kids to express themselves. Yeah, I saw that in the paper. That makes a lot of sense. And very different.
But you don't always want to hear that expression, right?
Yeah, just shut up and focus on getting a goal, right? Like, yeah. I can imagine, how that must be a threat to some mindsets, from a coaching and a teaching perspective. Yeah. Okay, so you were suddenly exposed with those programs early on, and so in your experience, because that's fascinating to me, because I had a sort of nervous laugh when you talked about therapy isn't just about sitting in a room and talking about the past, which is basically 99% of my healing work. And I'm like, oh, talking to me here.
But you are here doing this podcast, right? Which isn't just about the past, right?
Yeah, I'm sort of overplaying it, I'm sure. Of course, I've worked through a lot of my trauma and other work, yoga being one of them, right? I've definitely done a lot of healing work with yoga. But a very large proportion of it has been sitting in a room talking about my past, or sitting with my journal writing about my past.
Yep.
So I suppose in your experience, where do you think it's best to place the emphasis? And maybe this isn't a question you can answer, in general, maybe it is by individual, but your sense of where the emphasis should be played, is it working through the trauma that you're holding in day-to-day activities as best you can, or is it sitting in a room and talking about the past?
Oh, I think those are completely complementary. So I think psychedelics work is very hot right now, and one of the things that I think psychedelic work does that we can draw on, that doesn't have to be unique to psychedelic work, is this piece that the psychedelic folks call the integration piece. So you have your psychedelic phase where you go on your journey, whether it's ketamine or MDMA or psilocybin or whatever, DMT. And then you talk about it. You talk about what in the immediate aftermath and in the subsequent experience. You take that experience and you try to understand what it gave you, what it told you, how it connects, what's the through thread from the past to the present. And I think that's one thing that we could really do more with, understanding about how, like, these healing spaces that may be yoga based or sports based, or arts based, how do we integrate those into our current experiences? And I think that's a thing that the sort of mental health community, the sort of one-on-one kind of therapy community, can really support that work of not just focusing on the past, but bringing daily experiences in and learning from them and learning how to adapt from them too. So I think the integration work writ large is probably a good place to go. And I think the past is just part of it. I think people feel a strong push to vocalize what happened. And many people feel the deep need to tell that story and to be understood. And also, we need something for people who don't want that, who aren't going there. I come up with the sort of stereotypical hyper masculine sort of Marlboro man who does not want to talk about his feelings, but he deserves recovery too, right? Right. So get on the horse and, do whatever it is that you do out there. But there's so many spaces that people can make use of to recover. And so where do we put the emphasis? Your question on where do we put the emphasis? There's where do you put the emphasis for individuals, which is what I was kind of answering. But I think there's also where we put the emphasis society-wise. And I think parenting in schools are probably our best bets, and probably the two places that we would do best to focus. There's a lot of focus right now on social emotional learning in schools. And there's a whole push for trauma-informed schools. Marlene Wong has done amazing work with this. But there's a big risk of it becoming fairly, another requirement that schools have to meet. Right. Sort of teaching to the test in a way that isn't really fulfilling the promise of the and honoring the values of that kind of work, which is a resource question. Yeah. Which then sort of takes me back to the biology, because biology has this incredible power seems to persuade people that something is real. And it's a great tool for drawing attention and resources. So it takes me back in that direction. So that's part of now why I do a lot of integrating psychobiology into the work that I do that evaluates existing intervention programs, because it's what gets them funding. It's what gets them publicity. It's what gets them legitimacy.
We're living in a material world, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I can imagine. And okay, and that's fascinating. So talking about, the integration and whether that be as a result of therapy or plant-based, interventions and journeys. What are some of the, I suppose, the vectors or the lines of healing, the realms of healing that we can engage in integration in our day-to-day life? I mean, we've talked about earlier in the sports context, the breath work, the touching into feelings. Like, what are some of the other practices or approaches that we can bring to daily life that helps us, work through our trauma as we go along, so to speak?
Well, you mentioned writing. And I think that is a really fantastic way for people to work. Writing, I think, or anything, drawing or anything that gives you that concrete, tangible piece, I think is really important, because it allows you to track where things are going. It allows you to look back and maybe see back into a feeling that feels distant right now. So I think that's really critical. Writing also does, there's the work of, do you know James Pennebaker's work?
No.
Okay. So James Pennebaker, super interesting guy, who did a series of studies in the 80s, and this work continues on. He's at UT Austin, I think, or he was last time I checked. And he had the basic frame of the study. I might be sort of merging across a few of the studies, but was to take college undergrads and have them write 3 times a week for 15 minutes a day. And they were assigned to 2 conditions. In condition 1, they were just supposed to describe in as factual terms as possible their day's experience. And in the other, they were supposed to reflect on the emotions and experience that came up in incidents throughout the day. And his outcome was their visits to student health. And the folks who were in the expressive writing condition, the emotional focused writing condition, had by the end of a month, they wrote for a month, then by the end of the school year had far fewer visits to student health. This then got replicated in terms of shifts in their actual immune system function, shifts in their sense of well-being. I believe it was replicated with academic performance. It has some replication in mental health, although the mental health measures are paradoxical. And this is another reason I do psychobiology, because the more aware you become, sometimes the worse you look on a checklist. Because right. If you never trust the yogi who says I'm perfectly mindful, right? The more aware you become, the more you tune into the difficulties that you might have encountered in a day. The less you shut out, the more you let in. And so it doesn't always pan out in terms of the checklists and the symptom checklists. And my hunch is that that's moderated by self-awareness. So anyways, his notion is that what you're doing is translating something that is soft and schematic into something that is detailed and linear, which allows you to see sort of all of the assumptions and all of the biases that you were bringing into that. And it allows you to reevaluate it when you really do this detailed writing work. The other piece of that I think is sort of complementary is work from Chris Bruin and Emily Holmes, who do memory-focused work, and their work is about the idea. Their thesis, called dual representation theory, is that what happens that we process things in a sensory way, and we process things in a sort of logic and language-based way. So implicit and explicit memory, if folks are kind of familiar with that. And what happens in trauma is that you have implicit and explicit, but they're not connected anymore.
Just briefly for people who are hearing those terms for the first time.
Yeah. So implicit memory is you're a thing that your body does for you, and you can't really say how you do it. So riding a bike is the canonical example. You can tell someone how to ride a bike, and that will do nothing to translate into riding a bike. You have to do it with your body, and you have to feel your way through it. But that's different from example for making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. You can give a description of how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and it will turn into a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, more or less. So that's sort of the difference between implicit and explicit memory. Something you cannot really describe what your body does versus something you can narrate. So their idea is that what's happening is that the story of the trauma becomes disconnected from the feeling and the embodied experience of the trauma. And people may have both, but not concurrently and not in a way that is sort of experienced as woven together. So the notion is that one of the things that writing can do is help to integrate the sensory experience, because the pacing of writing is kind of gradual, right? There's a gradualness to writing. It's not as intense as like a visual flashback. You have to slow the visual down in order to translate that into writing. And that facilitates integrating explicit and implicit memory. Right. And there's work we've done on this as well that shows that people who have a lot of really early life trauma are really prone to kind of being primed with implicit memory, whereas people with sort of more adulthood trauma are really where their deficit is around sort of the explicit memory. And so there seems to be some way in which where you are in your lifespan also facilitates the how much of this is driven by implicit versus explicit memory. Right. That might take a bit of unpacking, but I'll let you lead the way on where we go next.
No. Well, yeah. So, from my first of all, on the implicit, that was very important distinction for me to get early on in my own healing work. It was just to get over the fact that just because I couldn't explicitly remember something from my past didn't mean I wasn't affected by that event, which is sometimes a common notion, right? In sort of public consciousness is, if you can't remember it, how can it be affected you? But yeah, we have these experiences from early, which are imprinted implicitly, that still are impacting our biology in the present moment. And the second point is we can retrieve implicit memories, right? We can go back into at least that's my experience, is I can go back into my body and I can relive and replay early experiences through my body, and by doing so, I can heal. That's been
I think that's especially what a lot of the psychedelic work is aiming for, and a lot of the embodied work is aiming for that.
Yeah. So writing is one means of treatment. Should we talk about yoga explicitly? Because I know you've done some specific research on that, and I was fascinated that even one session of trauma-informed yoga could make a difference. But talk a little bit about the work you've done in yoga.
So with yoga, this work, that study that we did in particular was with yoga in domestic violence shelters. And the yoga there is specifically, it is both for the residents of domestic violence shelters as well as for the staff. The staff who come into domestic violence shelters are often people who have personal experiences with domestic violence as well. So it's a sort of dual hit that staff experiences, and the turnover tends to be quite high. The reason we focused on single session was because people don't necessarily stay in a shelter for a prolonged period of time. And what we were looking for there wasn't so much, we were looking at before and after the session, just general stress level, and general connection with people's bodies. And one of the, in addition to the practicalities, one of the things that we hope that people can experience is just this momentary reprieve. And what we wanted to look at was whether even this 30 or 45-minute session could help people find that reprieve. And that's one of the things that so that was not necessarily looking at, they're not necessarily, cured of their PTSD after a single yoga session.
Right.
It's not a claim like that. But rather giving them, if you haven't felt calm in years, knowing that your body still can go back there and that your body still can do it is a really important sort of guidepost for people to know that, okay, I can't, even though that may be challenging to get to in my daily life, my kids needing a job, needing to find a home and all of that, maybe I can know that that's where I'm trying to go. And holding that in mind as a place we're trying to go was what we hoped we could give. So helping them see that even, and of course we hope they stay with it and, come for a whole sequence and incorporate it into their lives and all of that. And there's much about yoga that you don't need a teacher and a bunch of, fancy, you don't need $80 leggings to do yoga. But we wanted people to see that that's something they could maybe take with them. And so showing that it was helpful for them, even just in that moment, was really important. And we were able to show that those gains do snowball, but really just showing the momentary gain was really the most important part of that for us.
Right. And I suppose what's valuable about that is if people are having an immediate positive experience, they're more likely to go back. Because certainly in some of my early experiences with the sitting in the room and talking about my past, as you alluded to earlier, if you'd have surveyed me after those sessions, I'd say, well, I'm bawling my eyes out the whole time. I can't work. On a certain checklist, I would have come out, quite worse than I went in. But somehow I had the faith to keep going. But that type of intervention where you're getting some immediate benefit, I can see how valuable that is.
I'm adjusting my volume because a thunderstorm just kicked on so I'm just adjusting my volume. Okay.
And then my other question about that, what makes the difference between sort of a standard yoga class and a trauma-informed one?
And an actual trauma-informed one that doesn't have a sticker that says trauma-informed on the door, but doesn't actually do trauma-informed yoga. So this is the protocol we use the project was conducted with Exhale to Inhale, and the lead author on that is Sarah Barenbaum, one of my doctoral students who just finished last week, 2 weeks ago. And the protocol comes from Dave Emerson. And it, first of all, focuses, it really does not jump right into poses that are potentially really provocative. So if someone, for example, has experienced sexual assault, the posture of happy baby can feel really exposed. And so it starts in a way that has, that really, if it is a sequence, if people are expected to be enrolling in a sequence that builds towards things that might be more challenging and does a lot of prep work around, hey, we're going to look to move in this direction. But you don't have to go in that direction and you don't have to do anything. So the other piece about it that it really emphasizes is agency, around, and to do the agency piece, it uses the language of invitation. So I invite you to close your eyes, or you can keep a soft gaze on the floor, or you can do whatever feels comfortable for you in this moment. So it really encourages people to really, again, choose, like I use the language of choose from a menu, but here this is in the moment choosing from a menu of possible ways of engaging with the practice. So it's like the opposite of Bikram, where it's like super hardcore and like pushing you to suffer. The other piece about it is that it's very, very, at least either completely foregos or is very intentional around touch. So I went to a yoga class that had I was like, oh, it's got a little trauma-informed sticker on the door. And I was really happy to see that was there. And then the yoga instructor literally.
Wow, that's a thunderstorm.
Yes, there is. Yes, I'm not sorry. There's much I can do about that. I'm sorry. But literally did, while my eyes were closed, I was like in a warrior pose, did an adjustment where he grabbed my hips and put his pelvis against my hips and then wiggled me around. And I was like, I don't think that's trauma informed, my friend. Like that level of like, without completely no warning, eyes closed, and that intimate a touch was like, that's the opposite of trauma informed yoga. So if you were going to do an adjustment, you would ask first. And you would let the person know where you're about to land on them and all of that stuff. So it's a much more, it really gives people a lot of preparation, and a lot of ability to say where their boundaries are, which they won't necessarily always do. But there's also space to work through that in the aftermath too, I think is an important piece.
Yeah, that's part of the art of it, isn't it? Is if you're trying to set a boundary with somebody, is judging whether or not they're even in a position to negotiate with you on a boundary, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Absolutely.
that resonates. What I'm guessing is that those principles, of course, that we've developed in the trauma sensitive yoga can be applied to other physical activity. Yeah, sports.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of ways of, this is like when I do teaching, when I teach an undergraduate class, I do a lot of setting up. So I have a list of readings, and I specifically say in the syllabus, okay, you're supposed to, there may be 10 classes, and I'll say, try to write a response for 7 of the classes. And I say explicitly, you might find 2 or 3 of these are too close to home. And you need to opt out of those. Or I'll say, you're welcome if you need to step out of the room. That's really welcome. That's absolutely fine. If you need to do something else to self-regulate while you're in the room, that's fine. And if you want to just raise your hand and say, I'm having a moment here and can we slow down? That's fine too. And so that's, as opposed to doing trigger warning, this is going to be hard. You should all brace yourselves. I try to give people a sense of the menu and the options for how to engage and trust them to engage in the way that serves them.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. That makes complete sense. And I'm just, as we're talking, I'm reflecting on my own experiences with yoga, because I went to yoga classes before I did any therapy, started doing some therapy, getting really opened up. And then suddenly I couldn't do yoga anymore, like standard yoga, because I couldn't bear being adjusted. I couldn't do Shavasana at the end. I couldn't keep my eyes closed and just lie down because of the sort of terror state would start coming up. And, I really had to find the right places where I could do the work. And that's, it's very encouraging that now these practices are being studied. We're formalizing them. We're gaining greater understanding. We're developing principles. I think that's so important.
Did you find that your yoga before and after, it sounds like you got to a place where you got back to Shavasana and stuff like that?
Now I appreciate yoga far more than I did when I was my dissociated, unreconstructed self.
Yeah.
I think
that's a great example of how
any intervention or anything, right? Or maybe not. I mean, maybe the yoga itself would expose something I hadn't got to yet. But I certainly.
Well, you're ready for that. It sounds.
I'm ready for that now. Yeah. Yeah. But there were a few classes I had to just leave. One guy was, just very old school, Bikram style, and started literally shouting at me in the yoga session, and I just left.
Relax.
and he ran into the bathroom after. I was like, dude, just
he chased you?
What?
He chased you to the bathroom?
Yeah, I think you felt I think he got triggered by me leaving, and he was in his own spin about it. And
that doesn't. Yeah, sometimes shame is not an inappropriate response, but I'm sorry he chased you to the bathroom.
He was intense. He was certainly not a trauma-informed. Traumatized, maybe, but not trauma-informed.
Yeah, not the kind of information we're hoping for.
So that's great. And so we talked about the biology. You're obviously your work in biology. I'd be interested to know, what are some of the key biological markers you're looking for in people recovering from trauma, and what do you tend to see shift as people engage in the various approaches that we've described?
Yes. So most of the work that I do with my lab is with the autonomic nervous system. So I've done a little bit of neuroimaging, so fMRI work, and I've done a little bit of EEG work. But most of what I do is with the autonomic nervous system. And one reason for that is just practical. It's much easier to take into the field. I have a paper right now that's just about to go in that is with a program in internally displaced people's camps in South Sudan. I can't get a scanner into South Sudan. I can't do that kind of work there. But I can do work with the autonomic nervous system, which can be measured really easily with tools that are basically, folks from the pandemic became often familiar with the photoplethysmograph, the PPG, which is like a finger clip or an ear clip. People were doing these to get their pulse ox and their heart rate. during COVID. You can buy them on Amazon. You can buy, we use this fancier version, but you can buy them on Amazon for $15 or something. And what that essentially is giving you is a moment-to-moment measure of someone's heart rate. And what that then gives you, not the heart rate so much itself, because actually heart rate on its own is not a terribly informative measure, but the fluctuation in heart rate over a 2 to 5 to 10 minute series tells you something about the functioning of the parasympathetic nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system, also called the vagal nerve. And what this measure is also called heart rate variability or respiratory sinus arrhythmia. So HRV or RSA are the other names people see here. Vagal tone is the other word for this. And the parasympathetic nervous system is really cool, in my opinion. And for reading more on this, Julian Thayer is the person whose work is just blows me out of the water on this. If you have a certain sort of pattern in the variability of your heart rate, we think that the ability of the functioning of your vagus we think of as stronger. The function of your parasympathetic nervous system is stronger. I'll say vagus, sort of. And your vagus innervates at the 10th cranial nerve with a lot of the structures that seem to be related to self-regulation, self-knowledge, and social attunement. So it's this really interesting nexus of your ability essentially to calm down and be present, to attune to yourself, and to attune to others. So it doesn't just innervate your heart. That's just where we measure it. It innervates your face. So people who, people with autism tend to have less facial expressivity that corresponds to low vagal tone. It innervates your larynx. So your vocal shifts over time, your prosody, the tone shifts in your voice that you've used to communicate emotion. Those drop when your vagal tone drops. It also innervates in addition to your heart. So it primarily slows your heart rate. Overall, it slows your heart down in a way that corresponds to your breathing. It also innervates your gut to facilitate direct blood flow, helps direct or signal the direction of blood flow to your gut to support digestion and stuff like that. So when you're in a what we call a fight or flight or a sympathetically driven mode, your voice range drops, your face might sort of freeze, and your blood goes to your extremities so that you're prepared to respond to a threat. But if your body does that all the time and your gut is chronically deoxygenated, you're going to be more prone to developing things like IBS or diverticulitis or other gastrointestinal illnesses because you really don't have, it's just your gut's hypoxic. And in terms of your heart, this is the thing that your heart actually, the way this works is super interesting. Your resting heart rate as a human is 60 to 80 beats per minute. If you were to take the nerves of your autonomic nervous system off your heart, it would actually be 110 beats per minute. So your heart is always ready to respond. And your parasympathetic nervous system, your vagus nerve, is always slowing your heart down. Because think of, for folks who drive, think of the idle of a car. You have your car always has a little gas in the engine so that you're not starting from a dead stop, because that's actually really difficult to do, like kinetically, to start from a dead stop. So you take your foot off the brake, your car rolls forward, and then you hit the gas and you really accelerate. So that accelerator is the sympathetic nervous system. That brake is your parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the other thing, so this seems to be an index of all of these self-regulatory, self-awareness, and self-soothing processes and social processes. And so I look at whether with some of the folks we've collaborated with who are doing intervention programs, we look at whether there are shifts in the parasympathetic activity over time. The other thing about parasympathetic activity, in addition to being like cheap and easy to measure and fairly reliable, is that low parasympathetic activity is a major predictor of early mortality. Studies by Thomas Bigger show that if someone has heart rate variability below a certain threshold, measured on a 2 to 5 minute time scale, quick measurement, their likelihood of mortality, of all cause mortality over the next, I believe it's 7 years, is about 3 times higher than people within the normal range, which is extremely powerful. So showing shifts in that, you can't heal if you're not alive for it, right? So showing shifts in that, and the way that like mortality actually is integrated with your self-awareness, your self-regulation, and your social processes, to me is just such an interesting and compelling tool to be using. So that's one of my go-tos in the biology sphere.
Right. And you mentioned those 3 factors there. So just go through them again. So your self-regulation, your social regulation, and there was a third there.
Self-awareness.
And self-awareness, right?
Yeah.
And those are as you see it, are those the 3 main areas of focus for people improving their regulation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think so by self-regulation here, I mean the ability to focus and attend and the ability to calm down. But I also mean the ability to respond when you need to respond. We often talk about self-regulation as like, calm down, quiet. But self-regulation is also, getting out of the way of a bus that might be about to hit you. Self-regulation is also having the energy to make it through an exam without falling asleep or zoning out, right? So self-regulation is both up-regulation and down-regulation. Self-awareness is such a critical component of all other self-regulation. And social regulation is so relevant for supporting self-regulation. Self-regulation does not exist in a self-contained vacuum. We are social creatures. We integrate with each other, and our bodies actually regulate more readily and more easily in social presence. So this is the work of Jim Cohn in social baseline theory, and Marlene Gonzalez, who does all of this contextual emotion regulation work, to look at how being with people, though people can be the ones who really cut us down, people are also, in many ways, the thing that really lift the burden to make life so much more manageable. I think having those 3 together is kind of the secret sauce for healing.
Yeah, and you can see how one's ability to find yourself in spaces which are going to help you help with social regulation, i.e. people who are in a place where they can help you regulate, requires self-awareness, requires self-relation, because to integrate socially requires those 2, so they all work together. And also just putting yourself into a group setting where you're going to be receiving help to self-regulate, so that the whole, I can see how that whole nexus is sort of self-refers and self-embellishes, right? That the whole thing works together.
Yeah, it's a nice upward spiral.
Yeah, an upward spiral. Yeah. And then coming back to the trauma work, you can see how all of those are at play in a well orchestrated trauma-aware session.
Yeah.
And then what you're seeing is this shift in the parasympathetic as people get stronger in all 3 of those spheres.
Yes, absolutely. So this program with South Sudan that we worked with, it's 3 weeks of intensive programming, and then another 6 weeks of sort of mentored and weekly sessions. And these are folks whose jobs touch trauma, but they don't think of themselves in that way. So teachers, clergy, medical staff, police staff, and the program, and this is Ilya Yasevich and Anita Shankar's Global Trauma Project. The program is really neat. It sort of pitches itself as like, be better at your job, have an easier time at work. And people come into it and they're like, oh yeah, this is super stressful, and all these people I deal with are crazy, and I need to reduce my stress. And then by the end of the first 3 weeks of the program, they're like, oh, this is me. I am the traumatized person. I am the trauma exposed person that needs this. And that will help me do my work in a stronger way. It's a lovely program.
Right. And I'm wondering if there's anything we haven't really touched on here in terms of those three areas that might be worth emphasizing, just for thinking about people who themselves know they've got work to do, or in a context where they're aware others have had high trauma exposure and are seeking to help.
Yeah. Well, with the self-awareness piece, I think if you're sort of mapping these on to different kind of ways of acting in the world, the self-regulation piece can be supported, in a therapeutic context, but can also be supported in spaces that, with movement, with arts, with all of that, or it can be just focused like skills-based breathing work or progressive muscle relaxation, all of that work. There are a lot of different ways to approach that. The self-awareness work, I think, anything that facilitates expression, there's so many ways to do that as well. But the goal there is to help people get out of the sort of stereotyped and vague narratives. So right. I've had clients who, when I say things like, how was your day? They'd be like, it was like, okay. So defining a little more clearly and putting a little more structure to that emotional experience. Or a client who I was doing some arts-based work with, I would be like, okay, let's put your feelings on paper. And she would literally take all 64 crayons out of the box and just smear them all over the paper. And she'd be like, this is how I feel. And my goal with her was to parse those out a little bit, like to try to help her see the sequence of her feelings and to help her feel one thing at a time. Even though if you focus on the whole picture of her whole life, of course she felt all 64 colors at once, but to take one thing at a time and to slow that down. So her art then turned into more like stained glass and pulled. So it was all there, but it wasn't all filtered in this blur. And then in terms of the social pieces, the most consistent in the therapeutic sphere, the most consistent predictor of a positive outcome is the relationship between the client and therapist. So any therapy that doesn't make space for that is, I think, kind of really losing an opportunity, because it is it is just the thread that runs through every form of therapy. The working through, here I draw more from a model that, the more sort of psychodynamic or psychoanalytic work where the client has the opportunity to say, I didn't like what you said. And the therapist then works through the repair, as opposed to just saying, well, I'm sorry you didn't like it, but this is what's in the therapy manual. You're doing it wrong. But really to say, what was that like for you? And to tolerate that conflict and show another way of working through a conflict, which is so much of what didn't happen in trauma, right? A person couldn't disagrey with an authority figure and have that be not dismissed or not smashed. I think those things all support each other.
Yeah, well, and that works. What you've just described, that works on two levels, right? It's in that moment, having that person be able to develop that ability to challenge and express themselves in new ways, which of course itself is healing. But it's also allowing for the regulation, because unless the therapist in this case is modifying their behavior in concordance with what the client needs, then you're not going to get the regulation which enables the process to happen.
Yep. 100%. Yeah. That needs to be responded to in the moment.
No, this is all very powerful stuff. The question that's in my mind here, so everything we've touched on and we've described, it's all been secular, if you like, right? Is there any sense to which you explore the spiritual aspect here? Is that something that's come into your work? Is that
that's a neat question. So when I've done some of the work around the spiritual, it's been more around people's experience of connection with something larger to them than themselves. So that it has a secular vibe to it that can be translated into religious or spiritual spaces. But it is really a place that, so my version of the history of the field is that trauma was dismissed for a really long time by all of psychiatry. That's a whole other story. But in an attempt to gain legitimacy, the field moved in the direction of becoming very scientific and very medical. And as it did that, it squeezed out any conversation of the spiritual, which scientists and medical folks don't tend to do a great job of thinking about spirits and souls and thinking about something that they can't touch and measure. And so there hasn't been a lot of devotion to that area. But it is, of course, it's so critical to what people experience. And there are frameworks for it. They just tend to come from outside the scientific sphere.
Right. Yeah. I was curious to see where that entered, but it sounds like, you're working very much within the sort of established secular paradigm, right?
Yes, but there are also, the critiques, to me, one of the most persuasive critiques for why the field needs to do a better job of making space for spirituality has been that this is often, there's so many racially minoritized communities who we don't serve and who aren't interested in our work, in part because it doesn't make space for this dimension of their lives. So in North America, there are tons of indigenous healing practices that just would say we are at odds. Like, we view this we have great ways of addressing trauma recovery. Joe Gaughan has some really, really fantastic work on documenting this. And it's not based on habituating my nervous system. It's based on understanding my ancestors' trauma and how I'm carrying that. And that's a spiritual question. Within the Black American community, the same question arises of what is the role of our spiritual connection and our engagement with a higher power, and how that connects with trauma, and then how that connects with and a sort of religious understanding or spiritual understanding of systematic oppression from a spiritual perspective of the work of the devil. And there's so many communities who we don't include because we exclude the spiritual side. So it's an important calling to incorporate, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting to see how that will evolve, right? Because it seems right now they're on somewhat separate tracks, right? The sort of the research, the field of trauma research and research in general, but by both the psychobiology we've been talking about, but treatment, and then the spiritual realm, which has its own way of and frame for dealing with it. I did see one paper that suggested that found that if you pray before a therapy session, there were slightly improved outcomes. So,
really?
Yeah.
It's not so different from, I keep returning to the psychedelic question, but in psychedelics, there's like the set and setting, there's the intention setting of going into the work that differentiates a healing experience from like a good party. And it seems like that is a consistency between those two things as well, like going into it with a specific intention that prayer may help set.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that. And I was speaking to somebody else who goes out, and funnily enough, in Sudan as well, and she goes as part of a Christian context, and they do talk about trauma, and they have people share stories about trauma, but then offer prayers for the healing of that individual, right? So they're again mixing the paradigms.
Yeah.
It's an area I'm curious about. Well, this has been fantastic, Wendy. Is there anything we haven't touched on?
Oh man,
that you'd have liked to?
This is stuff I could talk about all day, but I think we've done a pretty good survey.
Great, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that it's been awesome. Okay, so we'll put links to the Trauma Research Foundation
Oh, sure.
Into the show notes. Is there anywhere else you would send people who might be interested in some of the topics we've talked about?
I'm happy to share my lab website, but
We'll put that
I think
in there
TRF
as well.
TRF has a great batch of resources for people who are looking for any. One of the other great resources is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and that's a great has just an unbelievable scope of tools. And while most of it is kid focused, it also talks about systems work. Talks about systematic oppression, talks about different forms of treatment, talks about parenting and all sorts of other stuff in there in a way that, when you look at kids in trauma, I think you can kind of understand all of us. Right. And so it's useful, I think, beyond just looking at the therapy for the little ones.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you. We'll put a link to your lab. We'll put a link to the Trauma Research Foundation. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to staying in touch.
Yeah, thank you. This has been great. Thank you.